One general thought war was a race. You won by never stopping. The other believed you couldn't win a race if you were dead. Together they helped destroy Nazi Germany. Apart they nearly destroyed each other. This is the story of George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery. To men who hated each other, needed each other, and changed the course of history, whether they liked it or not. But before we dive in, if you're new here, hit subscribe and smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow. And drop a comment below if you or anyone in your family served in World War II. I read every single one. George Patton didn't just believe in war. He believed he was war reincarnated across centuries. In his mind, he had charged with the legions of Rome. He had bled under Napoleon's banners. By the time he put on an American uniform, he felt like he had been preparing for it across multiple lifetimes. He wore custom-designed uniforms and ivory-handled revolvers, not because he was theatrical, but because he genuinely believed appearance projected power. His soldiers didn't follow him out of obligation. They followed him because they believed he could not lose. His philosophy was simple and brutal. Speed kills your enemy, not you. When Patton's Third Army burst out of the Normandy hedgerows after D-Day, they moved so fast, the Germans couldn't draw a coherent defensive line. His tankers started calling themselves the Ghost Corps, because they kept materializing somewhere the enemy didn't expect. Patton once told his officers that a good plan you execute today beats a perfect plan you execute next week. He didn't say it as a management tip, he said it as a military doctrine he was willing to bet lives on. But Patton carried demons with him too. He slapped 2 shell-shocked soldiers in a Sicilian field hospital, calling them cowards to their faces. The incident almost ended his career. He made speeches and off-the-cuff remarks that sent politicians and journalists into fits. He could not stop himself from saying what he thought. And what he thought was frequently explosive. That mouth would cost him command, cost him glory, and ultimately cost him the one thing he wanted most: to keep fighting when the war was over. Bernard Montgomery arrived at the war from a completely different direction. Where Patton was fire, Montgomery was architecture. He planned campaigns the way an engineer plans a bridge, with obsessive attention to load-bearing points, failure conditions, and redundancies. Before the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, he made sure every officer under his command, right down to the junior ranks, could explain the plan back to him in detail. He studied Rommel's supply lines, his armor concentrations, his habitual tactics. When Montgomery finally attacked the desert, Fox had nowhere to turn. Britain got its first major land victory of the war, and Montgomery became a national hero overnight. He wore a simple, black beret with TCAP badges pinned to it, a deliberate choice that made him instantly recognizable to every soldier in his army. He understood that a commander needed to be known to his men, not just obeyed by them. But Montgomery had a flaw that ran just as deep as Patton's recklessness, and it was arguably more corrosive. He could not share credit. Every victory needed to be his. Every setback needed to be someone else's. He operated from a place of deep insecurity about his place in history, and it leaked out constantly in his dealings with American commanders. He treated Eisenhower's headquarters like a school board he needed to manage, rather than a partnership he needed to nurture. And where Patton was slow to think about casualties, because he believed speed minimized them, Montgomery was slow to attack, because he knew Britain was running out of men. By 1940, Britain had been at war for 5 years. The country had already lost a generation in the First World War. Montgomery understood that every soldier he buried was a wound Britain might not recover from. His prudence wasn't cowardice, it was arithmetic after D-Day. Both men wanted the same thing: to lead the knockout blow into Germany. Montgomery proposed Operation Martin Garden in September 1944, a bold airborne assault through Holland, designed to leap across the Rhine River and cut straight toward Berlin. It was the most ambitious Allied operation since the Normandy landings, and it was a disaster. British paratroopers landed at Arnhem and were surrounded and destroyed. The bridge was a bridge too far. Montgomery, who had built his reputation on meticulous preparation, had gambled and lost meanwhile. Patton was blazing across France. His Third Army liberated more territory in a shorter time than any force in the history of the war, but fuel kept running out because Eisenhower's logistics system was routing priority supplies northward. Toward Montgomery, Patton was furious. He became convinced, and historians still debate whether he was right, that if he had been given those resources, he could have ended the war in 1944 and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, punching a massive hole in American lines and sending Allied headquarters into a controlled panic. Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of American forces north of the Bulge, but it was Patton who performed the miracle. He pivoted his entire army 90 degrees in 3 days in winter and drove north into the German flank. Military historians still study it. It was an act of logistical and operational genius that had no real precedent. When the dust settled, Montgomery held a press conference. He stood up in front of the camera and effectively told the world that British forces had ridden to the rescue of the Americans. American generals were incandescent with rage. A formal apology was eventually issued by the British government. Patton described Montgomery in his diary in terms that can't be repeated on this channel. By early 1945, both men were racing toward the Rhine. Montgomery planned a massive set-piece crossing. Weeks of preparation, airborne divisions, rolling artillery barrages, the works. It would be one of the most heavily orchestrated military operations of the entire war. Patton found a weak spot and drove across at Oppenheimer on March 22. He called his superior General Omar Bradley and told him quietly he had crossed the Rhine without losing a single man. Then he asked Bradley not to say anything publicly yet. He wanted to be miles ahead before Montgomery's great spectacle even began. The next day, Montgomery launched his crossing with the full complement of airborne drops, searchlights, and BBC coverage. Patton was already deep into Germany. Eisenhower ultimately made the decision to stop Allied forces from taking Berlin, leaving it to the Soviet Union. Patton believed it was one of the great strategic mistakes of the 20th century. He was already thinking about the next war, the one he was certain was coming with the Soviets. History would give him considerable credit for that prediction, even if the timing and the method he had in mind were entirely his own. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton had more prisoners, more liberated territory, and more ground covered than any other Allied commander. He was also more politically radioactive than ever. He made no secret of his contempt for denazification policy and his desire to confront the Soviet Union, while American armies were still mobilized and combat-ready. His superiors ran out of ways to contain him. His career was effectively finished. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with an army truck near Mannheim. The impact was low speed. Everyone else walked away. Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed instantly. For 12 days, he lay in a hospital bed talking to his wife, Beatrice, about the life he had lived, fully aware that his body had finally failed him after the battlefield never could. On December 21, he died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He was buried in Luxembourg, alongside the men of his Third Army, because that is where he asked to be. Some people have claimed his death was no accident, that he was eliminated because he was too vocal about fighting the Soviets. There is no credible evidence for this, but the fact that the theory persists at all tells you something about how large Patton loomed in the imagination of his era. Montgomery heard the news in England. The two men had not spoken warmly in months. Their rivalry had played out in the press, in memoirs in progress, in conversations leaked to journalists. Montgomery could have issued a one-paragraph formal statement and moved on. Instead, he said something that caught people off guard. He called Patton a great soldier. He called the drive across France one of the most outstanding military achievements of the entire war. He acknowledged their clashes, but said both men had been bound by the same determination to defeat the enemy in recorded accounts. Montgomery reflected that Patton had not embarrassed him by what he did but by what he proved was possible. A remarkable admission from a man who spent his career insisting that his own methods were the correct ones. He called Patton's death a genuine loss to the Allied cause. It was the most generous thing Montgomery ever said about anyone. Why does this rivalry matter beyond the history books? Because Patton and Montgomery represent two ideas about leadership that never stop being relevant. Patton believed that momentum is a force multiplier, that moving fast, accepting uncertainty, and keeping your enemy off balance saves more lives than caution ever could. Montgomery believed that preparation is not timidity, that a battle you win decisively the first time costs less in blood than 3 improvised attempts. The tragedy is that they were both right in different situations, and neither of them could see it. Patton's style was perfect for pursuit, for chasing a broken enemy across open country. Montgomery's approach was essential at all Alamein, where a defeat would have handed Hitler the Suez Canal. Had they been able to collaborate rather than compete, the Allied command structure in Europe might have been the most formidable. In military history instead, they spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting Germany. But here is the thing. Montgomery understood when Patton was gone, when there was nothing left to compete for. Rivals often know each other better than friends do. They watch each other constantly. They understand the weight of the same burdens. When Montgomery paid tribute to Patton, he wasn't being generous out of politeness. He was acknowledging a peer, someone who had carried the same impossible responsibility and delivered in his own chaotic, profane, magnificent way. The war needed both of them. Europe was liberated because of both of them.